The hardest part of losing a farm is realizing it can disappear long before the foreclosure sign ever goes up. At 46, Caleb Mercer could feel Mercer Ridge Farm slipping away one season at a time. The Kansas ground his grandfather had started farming after World War II no longer responded the way it once had. Each spring demanded more seed, more fertilizer, more diesel, and more borrowed money. Yet every harvest seemed to return a little less. The soil had turned pale and hard beneath his boots. Rainwater ran across the surface instead of soaking in, and dry weeks left the fields looking exhausted before summer was even over. Caleb kept telling himself the next crop would turn things around. Then, one cold evening, Ruth Mercer spread the farm books across their kitchen table and showed him numbers he could no longer explain away. Equipment payments were climbing. Input bills were stacking up. The operating loan had grown heavier, and at their current pace, they might have only a few seasons left before the bank forced them to start selling ground. Caleb stared at the figures in silence. His grandfather had built this place acre by acre. His father had spent his life expanding it. Caleb had always believed his job was simple. Keep it alive long enough to hand it to the next generation. Now he faced the possibility of becoming the first Mercer in 3 generations to lose it. Bankruptcy would hurt, but that was not what frightened him most. What terrified Caleb was the thought that one day his children might drive past these fields and know the family story had ended with him. And he had no idea what could save the farm. But just when Caleb thought the farm had run out of options, he heard an idea that sounded less like a solution and more like undoing everything his family had spent decades building. At a winter agricultural workshop, a speaker described managed rotational grazing, moving livestock through small paddocks for short periods, then giving the ground weeks to recover. Hooves pressed dead plant material into the soil. Manure returned nutrients. Roots grew deeper during rest, and microscopic life slowly rebuilt what years of stress had stripped away. Caleb almost dismissed it. His father had taught him that progress meant cleaner fields, bigger equipment, tighter schedules, and more control. Now this method seemed to argue the opposite, that exhausted land might need less disturbance, not more. Still, the idea followed him home. A week later, Caleb told his retired father Hank that he was considering putting sheep on failed cropland. Hank stared at him as if desperation had finally clouded his judgment. He had spent 40 years replacing pasture with production ground, and now his son wanted to bring animals back onto acres they had worked so hard to modernize. Dean Voss laughed even harder when he heard about it at the co-op. To him, sheep belonged on pasture, not on land a serious farmer was trying to save. For the first time, doing less no longer sounded like surrender. It sounded like hope. But Caleb could not shake one question. What if the farm was failing because he kept forcing it to perform before it had time to recover? What Caleb did next turned a desperate idea into a public gamble, because instead of experimenting quietly, he put sheep on the one field everyone in the county had already written off. He chose the worst 35 acres on Mercer Ridge Farm, ground so thin and tired that even Caleb had stopped expecting much from it. If the plan failed, at least he would not sacrifice his best soil. He bought 32 ewes, strung portable electric fencing across the field, set up temporary water lines, and began dividing the acreage into small paddocks. The sheep stayed only long enough to graze the plants hard, trample dry stalks onto the surface, and leave manure behind before Caleb moved them again. The goal was never to strip the land bare. It was to create impact, then rest. To Caleb, every move of the fence felt like a test. To Dean Voss, it looked like proof that desperation had finally taken over. At the co-op, Dean joked that Caleb was trying to save dirt with sheep, and the line spread fast enough to make Caleb regret mentioning the plan. Worse, for months, the field seemed to support Dean's argument. The grass remained thin. Bare patches stayed bare. Dust still lifted under Caleb's boots. Nothing about the place looked rescued. Even Hank drove past, slowed beside the fence, and left without saying a word. At night, after Ruth had gone to bed, Caleb sat at the kitchen table adding up the cost of fencing, livestock, and feed, wondering whether he had spent money the farm could not afford to lose. He had told everyone this was a test. In private, he feared it might be the mistake that finished Mercer Ridge for good. Then, just as his confidence began to crack, the field gave him the first sign that something underneath might be changing. But the first real breakthrough was so small that anyone driving past the field would have missed it completely. During the second growing season, Caleb noticed tiny patches of clover pushing through places that had been bare for years. Then the grass began holding its color longer during dry stretches. Beneath the thicker cover, the soil felt cooler and softer under his boots. And after a spring rain, water that once raced toward the ditch seemed to disappear into the ground instead. One morning, Caleb turned over a clump of soil and found earthworms twisting through the roots. He stood there longer than he expected, remembering how common they had been when he was a boy following Hank across the farm. None of these changes looked dramatic enough to prove anything, so Caleb began recording them in an old field notebook. Rainfall, grazing dates, grass height, bare ground patches, even how long moisture remained after storms. By the third year, the difference was harder to dismiss. Caleb carried the same shovel from a conventionally managed field into the sheep pasture and pushed it into both. The first soil came up pale, dense, and hard, breaking into stubborn chunks. The pasture soil crumbled apart in his hands, darker and threaded with fine roots. Hank happened to be watching. He said nothing. But later Caleb saw his father kneel beside the pasture, scoop up a handful of the darker soil, and rub it slowly between his fingers. For the first time, Hank looked less skeptical than curious. Caleb still did not know whether the change was enough to save Mercer Ridge. But soon, someone outside the family would arrive to measure what his eyes had been telling him. But the story changed the moment someone arrived who had no reason to believe Caleb at all. By then, word of the unusual pasture at Mercer Ridge had traveled beyond neighbors and county meetings, eventually reaching Dr. Lauren Reeves, a university soil researcher who wanted one aim Caleb had never been able to provide: measurements. She did not come to congratulate him, and she did not come looking for a miracle. She came with sampling bags, metal rings, probes, and a team prepared to compare the recovering pasture with nearby conventionally managed ground. They tested soil organic matter, biological activity, vegetation cover, structure, and the speed at which water could enter the soil. One test stopped Caleb cold. The team pressed identical infiltration rings into two fields and poured the same amount of water into each. On the degraded ground, water pooled near the surface, slow to move and easy to imagine running toward the ditch in a hard storm. In the sheep pasture, it sank much faster. Other measurements pointed in the same direction: more living activity below ground, better aggregation, stronger plant cover, and soil that held moisture longer after rain. Dr. Reeves remained careful with every conclusion. She never called Caleb a visionary. She just looked over the early results and said, "Something measurable is happening here." That sentence mattered more to Caleb than praise ever could. For years he had trusted what he saw with his own eyes. Now instruments were beginning to tell the same story. As more researchers asked to visit Mercer Ridge, the 35 acres neighbors once considered nearly worthless became the most studied ground on the farm. But one question still remained: could healthier soil survive the kind of weather that had nearly broken Caleb before? But numbers on a soil test could only prove so much. The real verdict would come when Kansas stopped giving Caleb rain. Encouraged by the changes at Mercer Ridge, he had slowly expanded rotational grazing beyond the original 35 acres, moving sheep through larger sections while still giving each paddock time to rest. Then summer turned brutally dry. Week after week passed beneath a hard, cloudless sky. Roadside grass faded to brown, ponds dropped lower, and neighboring crop fields began curling at the edges before noon. Caleb watched the forecast every morning, knowing that a few more weeks without rain could erase years of progress. For the first time since Dr. Reeves had tested the soil, he wondered whether the recovery had only looked impressive under favorable conditions. The pasture suffered too. Grass growth slowed, some plants lost color, and Caleb adjusted the flock's rotation to avoid grazing stressed areas too hard. But something was different. Where neighboring ground dried quickly and hardened under the sun, the regenerated pasture held moisture deeper beneath the surface. Plants with stronger root systems stayed green longer, and the soil beneath thicker cover remained cooler. Caleb could see the difference most clearly along the old fence line, where conventionally managed acreage on one side browned weeks earlier than the recovering pasture on the other. This was not a miracle, and the drought still hurt. But Mercer Ridge was bending without breaking. For Caleb, that changed everything. The experiment was no longer an idea, a notebook entry, or a scientist's measurement. Under the worst conditions the farm had faced in years, the land was finally showing that recovery could mean survival. But surviving the drought revealed something Caleb had almost been afraid to hope for. The healthier the land became, the less expensive it was to keep alive. When Ruth opened the farm books that winter, the difference was no longer hidden in soil tests or pasture color. On the acres Caleb had converted, he was buying fewer inputs, making fewer heavy equipment passes, and burning less diesel. The sheep were harvesting much of their own feed from diverse pasture. Supplemental feed costs were falling, and healthier animals meant fewer problems to treat. Market lambs added another stream of income. None of it made Caleb rich overnight. There was no single check that rescued Mercer Ridge. The farm was being saved by dozens of smaller gains working together. Lower operating costs, stronger forage, better moisture retention, less erosion, healthier livestock, and ground that stayed productive longer when weather turned against it. At the same time, the farm itself seemed to be changing character. Clover and native grasses spread through places that had once been thin. Bees and other pollinators worked the flowering plants. Grassland birds returned to fence lines Caleb remembered from childhood, and insects moved through pastures that had once felt almost lifeless. For years, Mercer Ridge had survived only because Caleb kept adding more money, more fuel, and more effort. Now the land was beginning to carry more of the burden itself. That was the moment Caleb understood the real value of recovery. He had not saved the farm simply by helping nature. He had made the farm more resilient. And resilience was finally showing up where it mattered most, in the bottom line for his family. But the final proof did not come from a laboratory or a balance sheet. It came when the men who once laughed at Caleb started showing up at his gate. One afternoon, Dean Voss pulled into Mercer Ridge Farm and asked to walk the pasture. Years earlier, he had joked that Caleb was trying to save dirt with sheep. Now his own input costs were climbing. Repeated dry summers had exposed weaknesses in his fields, and he wanted answers. Dean pushed a shovel into Caleb's pasture, lifted a dark, crumbly slice of soil, and watched earthworms disappear between the roots. After a long silence, he finally asked, "How often are you moving them?" Caleb knew exactly what that question meant. Soon, other farmers began visiting too. Some tested small grazing sections of their own, and local conservation staff organized field days to study what had happened at Mercer Ridge. Even Hank eventually admitted that his generation may have confused pushing harder with understanding better. 8 years after Caleb stood beside cracked, pale ground wondering whether he would lose everything, sheep now moved slowly across thick pasture on the same acres. The biggest change was not only beneath his boots, it was in the way he understood farming. Sometimes saving a farm does not mean forcing more from exhausted land. Sometimes it means giving the land enough time to recover. If this story made you see farming differently, subscribe to Solace Farm Stories and tell us in the comments. Would you have trusted Caleb's plan when everyone else was laughing?